My family didn't just finish dinner without me, they erased me from the table like I'd never belonged there. I walked into my parents' 32nd anniversary expecting a seat, maybe a smile, maybe the bare minimum of being their son. Instead, I found empty plates, cold coffee cups, and 14 familiar faces looking at me like I was late to a job they never paid me for. My mother didn't ask why I wasn't there. She didn't even pretend to care. She just slid a $2,000 bill across the table and said, "Since you missed dinner, you can cover it." My sister laughed. "You're our ATM, remember?" Something in me snapped. I tore the bill into pieces, walked out into the Seattle rain, and for the first time in my life I didn't apologize. I thought the worst was over. But that night the bank called. And that was the moment I realized my family wasn't just using me, they were planning something much darker. My name is Caius Mercer, and before I share my story with you, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far my story can reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection makes a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. And if you'd like to follow the rest of my journey, every truth, every wound, every step forward, feel free to subscribe. It means more than you know. I left HarborLink Freight that evening with my head still pounding from the chaos I'd spent the last 4 hours trying to contain. A container meant for Tacoma had somehow ended up headed toward Anchorage, and fixing the mistake ate every minute I had left before my parents' anniversary dinner. By the time I got into my car, the sky over Seattle had already opened up. Rain streaked across my windshield in long diagonal lines, blurring the lights as I drove toward the Redwood Grill on the waterfront. My mother had reminded me twice that morning that dinner was at 6. I kept telling myself that being late wasn't my fault, that I couldn't control a logistics emergency, but the guilt still sat heavy in my chest the entire drive. When I walked into the restaurant shaking rain from my jacket, the scene hit me like a punch. The long table where my family sat was littered with empty dessert plates and half-finished coffees. 14 relatives, no food left, not even a bread basket. They'd finished the entire dinner without me. My father looked up, raising his brows as if I were an unexpected guest. My mother simply crossed her arms and said almost casually, "We moved it up to 5. I thought you knew." Her tone made it sound like the oversight was mine. Before I could respond, Lennox let out a laugh. "Wow, Caius, right on time, just like an ATM." The entire table shifted with a mix of amusement and discomfort. Then my mother slid a folded receipt across the table. The total read a little over $2,000. She said, "Since you missed dinner, it makes sense for you to cover it." And in that moment, I felt something inside me still. The way they all looked at me, expectant, entitled, almost rehearsed, made me realize they weren't surprised at all. They were waiting, just like always. For years, I'd stepped into this role without thinking. The dependable son, the quiet provider, the one who paid without arguing. But that night, standing there in my soaked clothes while dessert crumbs lay scattered across their plates, something snapped loose. I picked up the bill, tore it clean down the middle, then into smaller pieces, and let the scraps fall onto the white tablecloth. Not a word left my mouth. I turned and walked straight out into the rain. The cold soaked through my shirt, but for the first time I felt no urge to turn back, no instinct to apologize. As I reached the parking lot, I heard voices behind me, hushed but sharp. "He's getting more ungrateful every year. Someone needs to remind him where he stands." That was the moment the truth settled in my bones. This wasn't just about dinner. Something deeper had been brewing in my family for a long time, and I had just stepped across the first fault line without realizing how far it ran beneath my feet. When I got back to my Capitol Hill apartment, I fell onto the couch, still shivering from the rain and the humiliation. I kept replaying the scene at the restaurant, the empty plates, Lennox's grin. My mother's effortless expectation that I would shoulder the cost of a meal I hadn't even tasted. It took a long minute before I could pull myself up and walk to the filing cabinet where I kept a folder I'd labeled Mercer Support. I had started the file 3 years earlier, telling myself it was for organization. Receipts, transfers, bank statements, every time I'd helped my parents with their mortgage, every time I'd covered Lennox's rent, every unexpected repair or emergency they said they couldn't manage. At first, the folder was a way to keep track. Later, I realized it was the only evidence that I wasn't imagining things. I emptied the entire folder onto my desk. Paper after paper filled the surface until the wood disappeared beneath the mess. Mortgage payments for my parents' house, Lennox's rent in Portland, a down payment on a car, repairs, dental work, credit card bills. I began tallying each one with mechanical movements, my pen tapping the page as the numbers climbed higher and higher. Then I saw something that made my stomach twist: a 4-person resort package to Palm Springs dated during a week I'd been working overtime at the warehouse. They'd gone on vacation, 4 people, and somehow my card had paid for it. When I added the final total, I pushed back from the desk so fast my chair nearly fell over. $52,891.66 in 3 years. My breath stuttered. I ran to the bathroom, gripping the sink as nausea hit me. It wasn't just the money. It was the realization that this wasn't accidental or occasional, it was systematic. Expected. I wasn't a son to them. I was a financial structure they'd built their comfort on. When the nausea settled, I walked back to the desk and began shutting everything down. I canceled every automatic transfer. I removed Lennox as an authorized user on my backup card. I blocked my parents' numbers, then my sister's, then every cousin who'd sat at that table pretending nothing was wrong. When I finally collapsed onto the floor surrounded by piles of paper, a strange mix of freedom and fear washed over me. I'd cut off the tap. But what would they do when they realized it? The answer came the next morning. I woke to 15 notifications from Facebook and a string of messages forwarded from friends. My relatives were posting publicly about me, claiming I was having a mental breakdown, that stress had made me unstable, that the family was worried and trying to get me help. They painted my silence as sickness, my boundaries as proof of collapse, and my refusal to pay for dinner as the act of a man who had lost control. They were rewriting the story before I even got a chance to tell mine, and I understood with a clarity that chilled me deeper than the rain the night before that dinner was only the beginning of a much larger truth I had yet to uncover. 3 days after the dinner, when silence from my family had settled into something heavy and sour in the air, someone knocked on my door. I expected a delivery, or maybe a neighbor. But when I opened it, there was Darian Wolfe standing in the hallway, holding a paper bag that smelled like garlic and tomato, and a worn paperback about toxic family systems under his arm. We hadn't seen each other in months, but he stepped inside like he knew exactly why he was there. He didn't try to comfort me. He didn't offer empty sympathy. He just looked at me and asked, "What happened to you, man?" I didn't know where to start, so I told him everything from the moment I walked into the Redwood Grill to the second I tore the bill in half. He listened without interrupting his expression, shifting from concern to something sharper, almost analytical, when I mentioned how calmly my mother had handed me a $2,000 bill. When I told him about Lennox calling me an ATM, he leaned back in his chair, studying me the way he examined case files. When I finished, he put the book on the table and said, "You're not outside your family, Caius. You're inside a system they built around your wallet." The words hit me with a clarity that felt like cold water. For the first time, I saw the pattern not as isolated incidents, but as an ecosystem, one that I'd been feeding without question. Darian asked if he could go through the documents in the folder on my desk. I handed him the Mercer support file, and he sifted through the receipts and statements with practiced precision. After a few minutes, he paused at a charge from a tech store in Portland. "You said you were in Seattle on this day, right?" I nodded. He slid the paper toward me. "Then your card was used without you. This is more than entitlement. This is access." The fear came slow rising from the center of my chest. I had thought dinner was the breaking point, but the more Darian spoke, the more it felt like I had only brushed the surface of something deeper. He suggested that I stop communicating with my family, at least for now, and observe. People who rely on someone financially always react when the supply changes, he said. Sometimes they tighten their grip. Sometimes they do worse. He told me to open new accounts, ones they didn't know existed. He helped me set up alerts and walked me through basic steps of isolating my finances from theirs. By the time he left, the sky outside had turned a muted shade of blue, and I felt like I had stepped into a different version of my life, one where I had to defend myself instead of defend them. That night, as I tried to unwind, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. All it said was, "Don't make this bigger than it is." Every family has things like this. The words had no name attached, but they had a familiarity to them, something I recognized in the tone. It wasn't a warning. It was surveillance. And it told me exactly what Darian had suspected. Someone in my family was watching me more closely than I ever realized. I sat there in the dim light of my apartment, staring at the message, and the truth settled in my spine. The bill at the restaurant hadn't been the beginning. It had been the first crack in a structure that had been built around me for years, a structure that was only now starting to show its shape. Whatever I thought I knew about my family, I understood then that the real story was only beginning. A week later, while I was in Portland handling a warehouse inspection, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered automatically, expecting a client. Instead, a woman from U.S. Bank asked if she was speaking to Caius Mercer. Her tone was polite, but formal in that unsettling fraud department way. She informed me that a Black Reserve credit card had been opened under my name 2 months earlier, and that the current balance was a little over $21,000. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mind stalled the way it does when you hear something you know is going to change everything. I told her I had never applied for such a card, and she pulled up the details. The card had been mailed to my parents' address in Bellevue. I asked for the email linked to the account. She read it slowly, Lennox.Mercer94. I felt the floor of my stomach give out. I hung up and called Darian immediately. He didn't sound surprised. He only said, "If this is real, Caius, it's a federal offense. And it means your sister didn't just use your money, she used your identity." When I got home later that night, there was a white envelope resting at my doorstep. No return address, no markings. Inside was a single slip of paper that read, "Don't ruin the family over this." The handwriting was slanted, almost rushed. I looked at the door cameras and realized I hadn't checked them since the restaurant. When I opened the app, I saw that the system had been reset 2 days earlier. Someone had accessed it without my permission. My heart thudded in my chest as I remembered the message from the unknown number. This wasn't coincidence. Someone was close. Too close. The next day, I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. A gray sedan parked across the street that seemed to always be there when I left for work. My neighbor mentioning someone knocking on my door while I was away. A figure lingering in the hallway outside my building on a night I came home late. Paranoia seeped into my thoughts, but it didn't feel irrational. It felt logical. If they had opened a credit card in my name, what else had they done? 2 evenings later, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. She wrote, "Someone in the family is really worried about you. We're trying to check on you." Attached was a photo of Lennox standing directly outside my apartment door, smiling like it was a casual visit. She hadn't called. She hadn't knocked. She'd just come and stood there. I stared at the picture for a long time, a tightness spreading through my hands and chest. It was the same feeling you get when you realize someone has crossed a line without even acknowledging the boundary. They weren't just using me. They were tracking me. They were managing me the way someone handles a resource they're afraid of losing. I set the phone down and walked to the window, the city lights flickering off the glass. I had always believed my family's dysfunction was rooted in carelessness, maybe selfishness. But standing there with the evidence laid out in front of me, from the fraudulent card to the reset camera to Lennox's unannounced appearance, I understood that it was more than that. This was control. This was intrusion. This was a kind of possession masquerading as concern. And for the first time, I realized I was no longer dealing with a family that took me for granted. I was dealing with people who had crossed legal lines, ethical lines, and personal lines without hesitation. I was dealing with something I could no longer ignore. And the part that unsettled me most was knowing this was only the beginning of what they were willing to do. I drove to Bellevue with a tightness in my chest that didn't ease even as I turned into my parents' cul-de-sac. Everything looked painfully normal. My father was bent over the open hood of his car, pretending to tinker with something he had no intention of fixing. My mother stood in the yard clipping roses as if this were any ordinary afternoon, and Lennox lay on a hammock scrolling through her phone like she hadn't opened a credit card in my name. The sight of all three of them performing calmness made something in me settle, not peace, but certainty. They were hiding something, and they were pretending so hard it made the truth glow around the edges. I walked past my father without acknowledging his half-hearted greeting and placed the credit card application and bank statements on the patio table. "Explain," I said. My mother's smile faltered for a split second before she tried to brush it off. She called it an administrative mistake. My father chimed in saying banks get things wrong all the time. Their refusal to meet my eyes made my skin crawl. Then Lennox muttered under her breath, "I didn't even finish last month's quota." She froze the second she realized what she said, and the way my father shot her a warning look confirmed everything I needed to know. It was the first real crack in their facade. I felt something cold move through me. This wasn't just entitlement. This was a system, a plan, a practice. I asked them about the doorbell camera. I told them someone had reset it and accessed my home security system. My mother widened her eyes in practiced shock, but my father's expression tightened, and Lennox suddenly couldn't look at me anymore. That reaction alone was enough to tell me the truth. I hit record on my phone inside my pocket and started asking questions. The kind of questions you ask when you already know the answer. Who opened the card? Who used it? Who was in front of my door last week? Their voices layered over one another, denials, excuses, deflections, until my father slammed his hand on the table and said, "If you hadn't stormed out of the dinner, none of this would have been necessary." That was the moment everything aligned. They weren't just reacting, they were retaliating. They believed my refusal to pay their bill justified opening a $21,000 credit card in my name. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I gathered the papers, turned around, and walked toward the car. As I passed the dining room window, I saw my mother gripping Lennox's wrist, the two of them arguing in frantic whispers. I'd never seen fear in their eyes before, real fear, and that told me something else was coming. Something they weren't prepared to hide anymore. Back in Seattle, the weight of the confrontation settled over me like fog. I reopened the email from U.S. Bank requesting identity verification and asked for the complete application file. When the scanned documents came through, I saw my forged signature good enough to look familiar, sloppy enough to expose the lie. The next thing I noticed was the IP address used to submit the application. It matched one of the last IP logs from my smart home system. Someone had used my parents' Wi-Fi network to open the account. My pulse throbbed at my temples. I forwarded everything to Darian, and he told me to stop meeting them alone. "You're dealing with people who think they're entitled to your life," he said. "Stop acting like they're just impulsive." I followed his instructions, backing up every file I had onto multiple drives, and started writing down things I'd noticed for months, but brushed aside the random declines on my card, the missing Amazon packages, the unfamiliar logins I once blamed on bad memory. Then I found a transaction for a flight to Las Vegas purchased the month before. The ticket was for Grant Mercer, my father, paid for by the same fraudulent Black Reserve card. The airline verified everything. When I hung up, I stared at the wall, realizing that my father had been traveling on a card he knew wasn't his. The more I pieced together, the more the picture sharpened. The card wasn't an isolated act. My accounts had been used in scattered, subtle ways for months, maybe years. My mother knew my email passwords because she once asked to help me sort bills. Lennox had used my accounts for shopping travel, whatever she wanted, and I had been too busy, too trusting, too conditioned to question it. When I returned home that night, the door to my apartment was slightly open. Nothing was missing, but drawers had been disturbed. Someone had searched my files. Someone had crossed the threshold. I stood in the doorway, the air thinned, and in that moment, I knew what I was up against. I knew my family had moved from manipulation to intrusion, from entitlement to criminal intent, and I knew I had to stop them before they decided I was easier to silence than to steal from. The next morning I drove to Tacoma to meet Darian in his office, carrying everything I had gathered. He laid out the documents across his desk, bank statements, login histories, the forged application screenshots from my camera system and examined them with the intensity of someone preparing a court argument. He looked up and told me plainly, "This is identity theft. You can file right now and they'd all be implicated." His voice held no judgment, only concern. Then he warned me that once I made it official, my family might respond in ways I wasn't prepared for. People who depend on someone financially often fight hardest when they feel exposed. I left his office still processing the gravity of it all when I noticed a small piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. It read, "Don't drag the family into a mess. You won't win." No signature, but the handwriting curled in the same uneven way Lennox's always had. The threat wasn't subtle. It was personal. And it told me they weren't just scared, they were mobilizing. In the days that followed, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. At the grocery store, my aunt turned down another aisle the moment she saw me. A cousin I'd known since childhood barely nodded. The silence was coordinated. It felt like they'd all been instructed not to tell me anything, not to slip, not to break ranks. I turned inward and focused on fortifying every piece of my life they might still have access to. I combed through months of bank activity and found more unauthorized purchases, clothing, electronics, recurring charges I'd never signed up for. I realized Lennox had been using my old secondary card often enough to treat it like her own. She had bought jewelry subscription boxes and several transactions labeled personal care that I had never seen. One charge from a tech store in South Lake Union caught my attention. I drove there hoping the manager might remember something. He did. He recalled Lennox walking in and buying a MacBook and an iPad with my card. She said her brother gave her permission, he told me. She even showed me a picture of you. My stomach twisted. She had gone through my photos. She had used my face as collateral for her lies. When I got home, my phone rang again, unknown number. A man's voice, deep and unfamiliar, said, "Your family is looking for a lawyer. You should stop before this gets worse." I tried to ask who he was, but the line went dead. The message wasn't information. It was intimidation. I drove to Bellevue again. Not to confront them, but to see if they would even acknowledge what they'd done. When I walked into the house, I heard my mother in the kitchen on the phone. She didn't notice me at first, and I heard her say, "He'll come around. He always does. He'll pay eventually." The confidence in her voice was more disturbing than the words. My father appeared with a stack of papers in his hand, bank statements, credit documents, all spread out as if they'd been reviewing them together. The moment he saw me, he tried to hide the stack behind his back, but it was too late. I had already seen my name, the fraudulent card, and their notes scribbled on the margins. They had discussed the card long before I confronted them. They hadn't been confused. They hadn't been careless. They had done it intentionally, methodically, and as a collective. I walked out of the house without saying a word. Their performances, their denials, their threats had all been pieces of something bigger. And standing on that porch with the door closing behind me, I finally understood it clearly. They were not afraid of losing me. They were afraid of losing access to me. I walked into my parents' living room with my phone already recording my pulse steady in a way it hadn't been for weeks. This time I didn't circle around the issue. I didn't play polite. I looked at the three of them, my mother on the couch, my father standing near the fireplace, Lennox leaning against the kitchen doorway, and said plainly, "I know the credit card was opened illegally, and I know who did it." The shift was immediate. My mother clutched her chest as if I had slapped her. She said I was twisting the truth, said my accusations were hurting her more than I could imagine. My father's voice rose instantly, calling me ungrateful, telling me I was choosing outsiders over my own blood. Their reactions felt rehearsed, like a script they had used on each other for years. Lennox stepped forward with a smirk that barely masked her nerves. She said I didn't understand family responsibility, that I wasn't strong enough to carry what they carried. The confidence in her voice only made her slip more obvious. Without a word, I laid the printed records on the coffee table, every transaction tied to the stolen card, the Las Vegas flight, the purchase of the MacBook and iPad. Lennox's face drained of color. My father immediately turned to my mother, demanding to know why she hadn't stopped it. My mother snapped back, insisting Lennox only did what she believed I allowed. Neither of them looked at me directly anymore. I pointed at the stack. "Explain why the card was opened 2 days after your anniversary dinner." Silence flooded the room. Then my father broke. "Because you humiliated us at the restaurant," he shouted. The words hung in the air like smoke, undeniable. It was the first honest sentence any of them had spoken. I lifted my phone. "Every word you say is being recorded," I said. My father's face turned gray. My mother stumbled to her feet, panic rising in her eyes. Lennox lurched toward me as if she could rip the phone from my hands, but I stepped back and sent the file to Darian in one click. My mother's voice cracked into something sharp and desperate. "If you walk out now, you'll have no family left." For the first time in 30 years, I didn't swallow the threat. I didn't shrink. I looked at her and said, "I haven't had a family for a long time." As I opened the front door, I saw a black sedan parked on the curb. A man I recognized from distant reunions, the cousin who studied law, sat inside with a briefcase on his lap. They had called legal backup before I even arrived. The realization settled like coldness in my spine. This wasn't a misunderstanding. They were preparing for battle, and I walked to my car knowing the next step wouldn't be emotional, it would be legal, and it would be final. I spent that night sitting in the dark of my apartment, the city outside buzzing while my phone glowed on the table. I kept replaying the confrontation, the admission, the fear in their eyes. It didn't feel like a family conflict anymore, it felt like a siege. I sent everything to Darian, the recording, the documents, the photos. He responded within minutes, telling me the evidence was more than enough to open a full case of identity theft. He told me not to go back to Bellevue under any circumstances. Then he drafted a formal demand letter giving my parents and Lennox 72 hours to repay the balance and acknowledge the fraudulent activity before we filed the report. The next morning I sent the letter myself. I ended it simply. "If you do not comply within 72 hours, I will file the complaint." Less than 24 hours later, my mother showed up at HarborLink Freight. She walked into the lobby crying loudly enough to draw stares from the entire floor. She accused me of destroying the family, begged for sympathy from people who didn't even know her. I had to guide her outside, where she immediately dropped the theatrics. Her tears disappeared the moment the door closed behind us. She looked at me with a coldness I didn't recognize and said, "I needed to withdraw everything because there are bigger things going on in this family than you understand." I handed her a printed copy of the demand letter. "You have 2 days left," I said. Her face went pale before she turned and hurried to her car without another word. That night, my phone didn't stop ringing. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all saying nearly identical sentences as if they were reading from a script. "Family shouldn't fight over money. You're overreacting. You're hurting your mother." It was coordinated, manipulated, a pressure campaign disguised as concern. Then my father texted. Just 9 words. "You're not strong enough to take this further." It wasn't a warning. It was a belief. His belief that I was still the son who apologized, paid, and complied. He was wrong. The second day, I discovered that someone had requested a password reset for my primary bank account. It was the 3rd attempted breach in a month. I activated every layer of security the bank offered, then asked Darian to send a notice directly to the family's attorney stating that any further interference would be added to the complaint. By the 3rd night, with 5 hours left on the clock, I received an email from an unknown address. The subject line was empty. Inside was a single attachment, a complete spreadsheet of every transaction made on the fraudulent black reserve card, every charge, every location, every timestamp. I opened it and felt my breath catch. The file had been sent from Lennox's cloud account. She had accidentally forwarded it to me instead of to my mother. It was the final piece. Proof she wasn't just involved, she had orchestrated everything. From that moment, the path forward was no longer blurred. It was clean, sharp, and irreversible. 72 hours passed, and I walked into Darian's office ready to file the report. But before he even opened his laptop, my phone buzzed with a bank notification. $21,300 had been transferred into my account from my father. No apology, no admission, just a message. End it here. I rejected the temptation to respond. I used the money to pay off the fraudulent balance and had U.S. Bank close the account. Then I wrote my family one final email. All evidence is stored in multiple secure locations. If any of you ever use my name, my credit, or my identity again, I will file the complaint immediately. This is the last time we speak." The moment I pressed send, my phone lit up with dozens of calls and messages from relatives accusing me of betrayal. I blocked every number. Weeks passed. Lennox picked up 2 part-time jobs. My mother spread rumors about me abandoning them during a difficult chapter. My father pretended he had always planned to repay the debt. I didn't care anymore. I opened new accounts, started planning for a home in North Portland, applied for the senior operations director position. I went to dinners with friends who acted more like family than the people who raised me. One morning, a wedding invitation appeared at my door with a handwritten note that read, "Hope you've grown up by now." I put it into a drawer and forgot about it. That evening, my mother sent me an email with just one word in the subject line: family. I didn't open it. I didn't hesitate. I deleted it and emptied the trash folder. Standing by my apartment window overlooking the lights of Seattle, I finally exhaled, not with relief, but with clarity. I had walked away from blood ties, but I hadn't lost anything worth keeping. Some families are built from love, others are built from control, and some are meant to be left behind so you can finally breathe. I chose the path forward, and for the first time in my life, the path was mine alone. When everything finally settled after the emails were deleted, the accounts were closed, and the last thread binding me to the people who misused my trust had been cut, I found myself standing in a place I never expected: a quiet, unfamiliar freedom. It didn't come with celebration or triumph. It came softly, like the moment after a storm, when you realize the thunder has stopped and the world is suddenly strangely still. I kept thinking about that number 72 hours. What started as a deadline for my family slowly became a different kind of countdown. 72 hours to choose myself. 72 hours to break a cycle I didn't even know I'd been living in. 72 hours to step out of a life where my worth was measured in dollars, not humanity. And when I came out on the other side, nothing about them had changed. Everything about me had. There's something profound about realizing you don't have to keep bleeding just because someone else calls it love. Something liberating about setting down a burden you carried so long you mistook it for a part of your body. Something unbelievably peaceful about closing a door that was only ever half open for you anyway. I won't pretend it was easy. Walking away from family never is. There were moments when guilt gnawed at me, moments when old habits whispered that I should apologize, smooth things over, go back to my role. But every time those thoughts crept in, I reminded myself of the truth. Protection is not betrayal. Boundaries are not cruelty. And survival is not selfish. What I learned through all of this is simple. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the very people you must untangle yourself from to become whole. And sometimes healing begins the moment you stop convincing yourself that pain is normal. If you've ever been in a situation like mine, used, manipulated, guilt-tripped, or expected to give more than anyone ever gave you, I want you to know something: you're not wrong for wanting peace. You're not wrong for stepping away. And you're not wrong for choosing yourself, even if the world around you doesn't understand it yet. Before I let this chapter close, I'd love to know you're here with me. Comment "still here" or tell me where you're listening from. It means more than you think to know that someone out there understands, even for a moment. And if my story resonates with you, if you've lived your own version of this, or if you're still finding your way out, feel free to subscribe. Not for numbers, not for algorithms, but because sometimes hearing another voice rise out of the same darkness reminds us that we're not alone in the fight to reclaim our lives. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying. And wherever you are, whatever you're walking away from or walking toward, I hope you find your version of the freedom I finally found, the kind that doesn't require permission.